There was a man who lived in the heart of the city, surrounded by luxury. He was rich, very rich. His name didn't matter to anyone, after all his wealth spoke for him. He had everything: the best clothes, the newest cars, the grandest house. He was the kind of man who made others look twice, not because of his kindness but because of his wealth. His days were simple. He woke up, dressed in the finest clothes, and left his mansion. People greeted him with respect, some even admiration. To him it was normal. He didn't think much about the people who looked up to him. He knew they admired him because he had what they wanted: money. That was all that mattered. The rich man believed that wealth gave him power, status, and importance. He had worked hard to get where he was, and now the world bent to his will. He made decisions with ease, always certain of his place in life. Those without money, they were beneath him. He didn't even see them. He never thought about the struggles others faced, because, in his world, everything was easy. He had no idea what it was like to go without. Sometimes he would catch a glimpse of people on the streets, struggling. They were poor, dressed in old clothes, looking tired and beaten down. He would look away quickly. They weren't worth his time. He had his own world, and they had theirs. This was the rich man's life, a life of comfort, wealth, and quiet superiority. One afternoon, as the rich man strolled down the busy city street, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. There, standing near a street corner, was a man in clothes that looked older than the rich man's entire wardrobe. The poor man's coat was tattered, his shoes worn and covered in dirt. His hair was messy, and his face showed signs of wear and tear from years of hardship. He was an easy target for mockery. The rich man couldn't help himself. He laughed loudly, a sharp sound that cut through the noise of the city. He leaned in toward his friend who was walking beside him. "Look at that guy," he said, pointing at the poor man. "How does he even walk around like that?" His friend looked over, raising an eyebrow. But the rich man didn't care. He was already too focused on the man in front of him. He didn't even stop walking, just shook his head and continued. "How can anyone be so careless?" He muttered under his breath. The poor man didn't seem to notice. He didn't flinch or react. He simply stood there, staring into the distance. His eyes weren't sad or angry. There was no sign of embarrassment either. He just seemed quiet, peaceful almost. The rich man shook his head again, still chuckling. How could anyone let themselves look like that? It made no sense. The world was full of people who didn't understand what it meant to look presentable, to be someone others could admire. To the rich man, appearance was everything. The poor man had none of that. But what puzzled him even more was how the poor man didn't seem bothered by the laughter. He didn't care about the rich man's opinion at all. That made the rich man pause, even if just for a moment. Later that day, as the rich man sat in his study, he couldn't stop thinking about the poor man. The image of his tattered clothes kept popping into his mind. It wasn't just the way he looked that stuck with him, but the way he stood. There was something about the way the poor man held himself that felt different. Most people would have been embarrassed, especially after being laughed at. But the poor man didn't seem to care at all. The rich man leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest. He tried to shake off the feeling, telling himself it wasn't important. But the thought wouldn't go away. Why hadn't the poor man reacted to the laughter? Why hadn't he shown anger or shame? It didn't make sense. As he thought more about it, the rich man started to feel a strange unease. He had mocked the poor man, but instead of making him feel better, it left him with a sense of emptiness. Maybe he had been too quick to judge. He had seen the poor man's clothes and assumed he was nothing more than someone to laugh at. But now, something didn't sit right. The poor man hadn't flinched. It was almost as if he wasn't affected by the world's opinions. The rich man had grown up in a world where appearances were everything. He had been taught to judge people based on what they wore, how they looked, and what they had. But now, he was starting to wonder if he had it all wrong. Was it possible that there was more to this poor man than met the eye? He couldn't help it. He needed to know more. A few days later, the rich man found himself walking down the same street again. It was just another routine day, but as he passed the corner where he had seen the poor man before, he stopped. There he was again, standing in the same spot. But something was different this time. The poor man was still wearing ragged clothes, but there was something about him that stood out. He was standing tall, his posture confident, his eyes calm. He didn't look tired like before. In fact, he seemed composed, almost wise. The rich man couldn't put his finger on it, but the man's presence felt different. Curious, the rich man approached him. This time he didn't laugh. He just walked up slowly, unsure of what to say. "Hey," the rich man said, trying to sound casual. "We've met before, right?" The poor man turned to look at him. A faint smile appeared on his face, as though he had been expecting this. "Yes, we have," he replied, his voice soft but clear. The rich man was taken aback. He had expected the poor man to be surprised or even defensive, but there was no sign of it. Instead, the poor man's eyes held a depth that the rich man hadn't noticed before. "I'm sorry about what I said before," the rich man said, not sure why he was apologizing but feeling the need to. "I didn't mean to laugh. It was wrong." The poor man nodded, accepting the apology without question. "It's all right," he said. "I don't mind." There was a pause. The rich man looked at him more closely now, noticing the small details. There was a calmness about him that was hard to ignore. It wasn't just about the clothes or the way he carried himself. It was something deeper. "I have to ask," the rich man began, almost hesitant. "Who are you, really?" The poor man looked at him for a moment, his gaze steady. "I am someone who chose a different path," he said simply. "I live simply because I believe it's the most meaningful way to live." The rich man was confused. "But, don't you miss the things most people want? The money, the power, the luxury?" The poor man smiled softly, almost as if he understood the question before it was even asked. "I have something more valuable than all of that," he said. "I have knowledge, peace, and the freedom to be who I truly am. Those things can't be bought." The rich man stood there, stunned. He had assumed the poor man was just another beggar, someone who had fallen through the cracks of society. But now, he was realizing the truth. This man wasn't poor in the way he had thought. He had something far more precious than anything money could buy. The rich man's mind raced. Who was this man, really, and why had he chosen to live this way? As the poor man spoke, the rich man's thoughts began to shift. He couldn't stop thinking about what the poor man had said. "I have something more valuable than all of that." Those words echoed in his mind. The rich man had spent his entire life chasing wealth, believing it was the key to happiness. He had everything money could buy: cars, houses, expensive clothes. But now he was beginning to wonder if he had been chasing the wrong things. He looked at the poor man again, taking in his calm demeanor, and the way he spoke with such wisdom. The rich man, despite having more than anyone could dream of, felt a strange emptiness deep inside. He had never stopped to ask himself what truly mattered. He had focused on acquiring things, thinking they would bring him happiness and fulfillment. But now, standing in front of this man who had so little in material wealth, he could see that maybe it wasn't about money at all. The rich man felt small in that moment, not because of his wealth but because of how shallow he had been. He had spent so much time judging others based on what they had or didn't have. He had laughed at the poor man, believing his ragged clothes meant he had no worth. Now he was faced with the truth. Wealth didn't define a person's value. It was character, compassion, and the ability to find peace in life that truly mattered. As he stood there, he realized how wrong he had been. The poor man had something he didn't, something money couldn't buy. He had a life that was meaningful, a sense of purpose, and a contentment the rich man had never known. The rich man felt a deep sense of regret. How had he missed all of this? He had been so blinded by his own wealth that he never bothered to look deeper. The conversation with the poor man stayed with the rich man long after they parted ways. For days, he couldn't stop thinking about what he had learned. He had been so focused on wealth, status, and appearances that he had never considered the value of a simpler life. He began to see the world differently. The people he once ignored or looked down on now seemed to hold an untapped wisdom. The things that had once seemed so important to him, his luxurious possessions, his expensive clothes, and his reputation, now felt empty. The rich man started to change. Slowly but surely, his perspective shifted. He began spending more time with people from different walks of life. He listened to their stories and learned from their experiences. He visited the poor neighborhoods he had once avoided, seeing them not as places to be feared, but as places where people lived, loved, and struggled, just like anyone else. He realized that behind every face, there was a story that mattered. In the days that followed, the rich man found himself making different choices. He no longer cared as much about impressing others. He started dressing more simply, focusing less on looking the part, and more on who he was. He took time to help others, offering his resources to those in need. It wasn't about charity, it was about understanding that everyone, regardless of their circumstances, deserved respect. The rich man also began volunteering his time at local shelters and working with organizations that helped those less fortunate. His life had once been about acquiring things for himself, but now it was about giving back. His sense of pride shifted from owning more to doing more. He realized that there was true fulfillment in helping others, in being part of something bigger than himself. He never forgot the poor man. That brief encounter had changed him in ways he couldn't fully explain. It had shown him that true wealth wasn't about money at all. It was about living with purpose, peace, and an understanding of what really mattered.